We began a study earlier of the book of Ecclesiastes. In this book, Solomon, who made plenty of mistakes, but I think is represented by this book, who must have come back to God, come to himself, and come back to his Creator, starts out with the proposition that life without God is empty, and that nothing matters without God. And yet men are so stubborn that they'll hold on to emptiness rather than give God his place. Somebody might say, why do you waste time with all these examples from atheists and other men and their quotes? Well, I hope it's not a waste of time. I think it is more a representation of a point of view that's very alive and well in our day. And I'm holding it up so that all of us can see and our young people can see. As I said earlier, these folks are trying to sell you an empty box. That there's nothing, there's no satisfaction to be found in a life outside of God. Let me give you an example, if I might. I don't know if Stephen Jay Gould, that name means anything to you. I think he died fairly recently. But at one time, he was another one of these celebrity atheists. He was an evolutionary biologist somewhere up north, Harvard or somewhere. And he wrote an article in Life magazine that was entitled "The Meaning of Life in an Evolved World." And just fascinating to me to read a guy, a smart guy, brilliant guy, had more brains in his elbow than I got in my whole body. He just is as lost as he can be. And he wrote in part talking about mankind. This is his view of man. He said, we are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. We're here because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age. We're here because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. Don't you feel exhilarated? You know, you came from nowhere and you're headed nowhere. Your life means nothing. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way. Lord, save us, please, from another genius do-gooder who is smarter than God, who's going to reconstruct morality for us in his own image. Have we not seen enough of that? You don't have to be a great student of history, do you? They've seen that over and over and over again, and it ends up in disaster every time. They go to bring heaven to earth, and it's much more like torment by the time they're through with all their good intentions. Smarter than God. Solomon said that kind of wisdom is empty, and it is a false promise. Let me share one more with you. The name H.G. Wells, he was not a scientist, he was an author. He wrote science fiction, Time Machine, and what was some of the other stuff, War of the World. Not my cup of tea, really, but anyway, his books are still read. But he was also another British intellectual, atheist, humanist, about 100 years ago. And a nonfiction book that he wrote was an outline of history. 1,100 pages of humanist view of human history and where we've been and where we're going, all without God, of course. And at the end of the book, and I'll spare you the book report, but at the end of the book, he writes, now this book was written in 1920, that's important. And if you remember your history and your dates, you know that Europe had just come out of the First World War. 1918, I think, is when that ended. Terrible terrible loss of life, carnage. But there were a group of people at that time, intellectual, humanist, atheists, who felt like, man, we've learned our lessons and now we're on the verge of utopia. And that's where Wells comes from. He writes at the end of the book, he said, the Great War of 1914 to 1918 was the culmination of the military energy of the Western populations. And they fought and fought well because they believed they were fighting the, quote, war to end all wars. They were. They were, he said. Our world is very weak and feeble still. But war fever is over. Its temperature is, if anything, subnormal. It is doubtful if it will take the fever again for a long time. It was a long time, wasn't it? About 19 years. And then the Second World War happened. Anyway, he concludes, there are unhopeful prophets who see in the gathering together of men into one community. By the way, this idea of, what do they call it? Not one world, but anyway, this idea of this new world order with just everybody getting together and men all figuring out their problems. Nothing new about that. They were talking about that 100 years ago. They were talking about that 1,000 years ago. We'll just get everybody together and then we'll settle all the problems. We got the smarts. We can handle it. He said there are unhopeful prophets who doubt this process, who see in the process, in fact, the potential for trouble. But he said to see that trouble is to suppose that civilization is incapable of adjustments by men of different qualities and temperaments and appearances, but that will live side by side, following different roles and contributing different gifts. But he said, weaving together to mankind one community. He says, we know enough today, 1920, to know that there is infinite room for betterment in every human concern. Nothing is indeed needed but a collective effort. Our poverty, our restraints, our infections, our indigestions, our quarrels, our misunderstandings are all things controllable and removable by concerted human effort. Well, that sounds optimistic, doesn't it? Then World War II came and 85 million people died. And Mr. Wells was alive to see that as well. And at the end of his life, he wrote another book, a little book of essays, very small book. He called it, in one essay, Mind at the End of Its Tether. The title says a lot, doesn't it? So this is Mr. Wells in his 80s now, having just seen World War II. And the fellow who told us about the unhopeful prophets being wrong now writes, our universe is not merely bankrupt. There remains no dividend at all. After all, the present writer, talking about himself, has no compelling argument to convince the reader that he should not be cruel or mean or cowardly. Now, why do I use these quotations? Because this same nonsense you'll find today. But the advantage of looking at somebody saying that 100 years ago is they lived long enough to see how foolish it is. And so Mr. Wells at the end of his life would say, talking about human effort and human wisdom being the answer of all things, he said, well, I'll tell you where I am now. I can't think of a single reason to compel you not to be a coward or a low life. I wish you wouldn't. I'd rather our species ended its story in dignity and kindness and generosity, and not like drunken cowards in a daze or poisoned rats in a sack. But this is a matter of individual predilection. It's just a matter of choice. I don't really have anything to stand on. I think, to me, these smart fellows, if there were answers, they would have found them. I'll tell you what they found, and what Wells was honest enough to admit. He said, I figured out we don't really have any answers. Well, I knew that started. Solomon told me that 3,000 years ago. And I don't want you to be deceived ever by these same brilliant, well-minded, know-it-all, misguided souls who promise liberty when they themselves are the slaves of corruption. Solomon says, I tried to find satisfaction in wisdom apart from God. It did not work. In fact, what he said was, with a whole lot of wisdom comes a lot of heartache, and the greater your knowledge, the greater your pain. On that point, at least, Mr. Wells might have said amen. Well, that's not all that people use in searching out for meaning. There's some people who are trying to find the happiness in life with pleasure, hedonism. Second chapter of Ecclesiastes, verse 1, I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. Behold, this also is vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad. And of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting myself with wisdom, to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men that they should do under heaven all the days of their life. Wine, women, and song. Solomon said, I searched out pleasure with the idea in mind that that's what would fill the hole in my heart and bring me joy. You see this ad campaign a few years ago? Life is short. Play more Xbox. That's about the level of the answer the world has. Just enjoy yourself. Fill your time with meaningless pursuits, and you'll distract yourself until you die. Wine, women, song, enough said. Party. Life is short, party hard. And that kind of message, maybe not always put that bluntly, just comes through all the time. That's what you ought to do, is just do it. That's what Nike says. Just live it up. If you want to do it, just do it. Solomon said in verse 3, he said, I decided to make myself happy with wine. You ever notice people who set out to make themselves happy with wine do a poor job of it? You ever notice anything like that? People who are given to wine not happy. My son-in-law, one of my sons-in-law, works in the ER at the big hospital at UAB. And he's an x-ray tech down there. And he sees them come in every night. Every night they come in and they've done awful things to themselves and they're out of it. They don't know. It's just amazing the kinds of things that people find to get drunk on. Not just alcohol, but all kinds of drugs and household. It's just remarkable. You just wonder to yourself, how bad do you hate to be sober? That you have figured out a way to get drunk off mothballs or whatever it is, But there are people desperately trying to forget their life, and they think this will be the answer. And here's the newsflash: it's never the answer. But Solomon said, you can try it. And what you'll find is misery and heartache, woe and sorrow and strife, and wounds without cause and redness of eyes. We know the passage in Proverbs 23. It's a powerful passage. And just as true as it ever was. You'll be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, like one who lies on the top of a mast. They've struck me, but I wasn't hurt. They beat me, and I didn't feel it. When shall I awake? I'll have another. And he will. You probably heard it's not a biblical proverb, but I think it's based on this point. There's an old proverb that says, first a man takes a drink, and then a drink takes a drink, and then a drink takes a man. You've heard that. It won't take long before the drink will be drinking. And it might be that we're just almost out of control at that point. But we were in control when we took the first one. So you start down that road. You decide when to start. It'll decide when you finish. But it's ruination. And it's destructive. And somewhere down the line, my wife and I have talked about this through the years, somewhere down the line, when we were kids growing up, I don't know if it was from the preaching we heard or if it was from other sources, but when we were growing up, we were terrified of recreational drugs. Terrified of it. If somebody come up to me and offered me some pills or some drugs or something to smoke, it would have been about like you waving a live rattlesnake in my face. I would have run the other way. But we have a generation, and some of them have grown up in our homes. And somewhere down the line, not from their parents, but somewhere this world has convinced them, well, yeah, you don't want to miss an experience, try it. And they don't realize the fact you tried, and then it's quite possible you will be owned. Some of those opiates, some of those other drugs, they will own you from the start. Alcohol can do that with some people. Solomon was this rare exception. What did he say about it? He said that I gave myself to wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom. I take that to mean that Solomon was one of those rare birds that could toy with it and it didn't own him. He could just experience it and see how empty it was and put it down. There are some people who struggle to put it down. That's why they shouldn't have picked it up. That's one reason why. But whatever, the point Solomon makes is it will not bring you happiness. Wine, women, and song. We've talked about, you've thought about this through the years. The women, you think Solomon knew about women? 700 wives? 300 concubines? I've said before, I'm not sure, I'm from a small town, I'm not sure I could take a pen and a piece of paper and write down the names of 1,000 people that I know by name. Married to 1,000 or 700 wives, 300 concubines, however you want to put that. It's remarkable. I don't know how you remember their names. Maybe these were political marriages, blah, I don't, whatever. But I'll tell you what we find is that people still think in multiplying these relationships, now that's a real man right there. If he's a serial philanderer, boy, he's a real man. Oh, he's got the idea. You know, and I know, a man that's got 1,000 wives doesn't have one. He doesn't know what a marriage is. And a man who goes from one bed to the other does not understand the first thing about what it means to have a relationship with a woman. He sees them in terms that are dehumanizing and completely selfish. And he misses the joy entirely of a relationship as God designed it between men and women. Solomon said, I thought that'd make me happy. He said, I'll tell you what I found out. He said, I found out that it's more bitter than death. More bitter than death. I'd rather have been dead, he said, than be with these women. Their hearts are snares and nets, and their hands as fetters. He goes on to say, I have through my searchings found maybe one man out of 1,000, but I hadn't even found one woman of 1,000. I suppose that means that is acceptable and that is appropriate and a blessing. People through the years have looked at verse 28 and they thought, well, Solomon sure was down on women. I think we can read that passage and say, Solomon, you were sure lousy at choosing women. And I'm sure that was right. But just the idea of turning your lust loose and I was talking to a fellow, he owns a bookstore down in my area. Nice fella, completely a man of the world, you know. And we were talking one day, and he was talking about all the devastating and dangerous effects of sexual repression in our society. Did you hear what I said? He was talking about all of the negative effects of sexual repression in our society. And I said, I'll be honest, I hadn't noticed any repression in our society. I hadn't seen repression in our society for 40 or 50 years. I've seen nothing but license. Talking about it, showing it, glorifying fornication on every level. And that kind of indulgence, people think, they still think, that's the way to happiness. And Solomon said, you are completely wrong. And I know because I've been there. And I've tried all those things, and they left me completely empty and miserable and guilty. Better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. That's the end of all men. The living will lay it to his heart. This church is burdened by feelings of loss or impending loss. It's not a new experience for us, and it won't be the last. And where would we be if we did not understand the point Solomon came to understand? Sorry is better than laughter. By the sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better. A fool wants to spend his time in the house of mirth because he wants to avoid the most obvious fact, and that is that our time here is limited. But a wise man values that experience because he knows it really points him toward what's real in life. And that is that this life is not by any means all that there is. And we need to be ready for that which comes. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than the song of fools. As the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of a fool. This also is vanity. So much of what the world does, that's exactly what it is. You couldn't find a better figure than the Holy Spirit chose here. It's just like trying to heat up a pot with a bunch of thorns. They'll make all kind of noise, but they won't do anything for you. And that's life. It's just filled with a lot of noise. But as the world lives it, it's empty because God is not there. So, another rejection. Let's talk about one more. Solomon says that, you can try possessions. I did. I made me great works. I builded me houses, and I planted me vineyards, and I made gardens and orchards, and planted trees in them of all kinds. I made pools of water to water the wood that brings forth trees. And he said, I got me servants and maidens and servants born in my house, had cattle, small and great. I gathered silver and gold and peculiar treasure of kings and provinces, and I got me men singers and women singers and the delights of the sons of men, musical instruments of every sort. And I was great and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. And my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not from my heart any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. This was the portion of all my labor. And then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do. And behold, it was all vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. The idea of things bringing us joy and fulfillment. Is that gone out of style? Not that I've noticed. We live in a world that is just given to materialism. That if you got something, you're somebody. And the more you get, the bigger you are. And so people will sacrifice anything to get more. Well, if we got all we could ever get, we'll never have much Solomon had. I mean, he had it. He talks about gold and silver here. The histories tell us, this modern speech translation reads that Solomon in 1 year, gold came to him that weighed 49,900 pounds. I'm always a little bit leery about the conversions there, how to take ancient conversions and put it into our standard system. So I'm not always sure about some of that. I don't know if they had a different measure to measure gold with, but let's assume this is right for a minute. Don't do it now, but you might sometime check and see about, I don't know what gold is anymore. Is it $1,200, $1,500 an ounce, something like that. And here's 50,000 pounds coming in 1 year. That's a lot of money. That's more money than I'll ever see. That's more money than maybe several of us will see put together. That doesn't count all the profits that he received. That was just the gold that came in, I suppose, from his mines. And it talks about Solomon taking that money, and what did he do with it? He spent it. And the house of the forest of Lebanon and all of its decorations and the armaments, the symbolic armaments, the shields of gold. The thing that strikes us is verse 18 when he talks about the throne of Solomon. It was made of ivory and overlaid with gold. Every time I read that, I can't help but think about the question, why would you have a throne of ivory and then overlay it with gold? You could overlay a wooden throne with gold. And the best answer I've ever come up with is just because you can. Just because you're Solomon and you're the man and you've got more money than you'll ever be able to spend. And again, there's something very modern about that. Here's a kid he's from down at where I live in Podunk, Alabama, but man, he can run fast. And suddenly his athletics take him to some professional league where they dump a load of money on him. And he's not ready for that. I'm not sure I'd be ready for that. And so what he does is he begins to spend in all kinds of foolish ways. And I see a lot of that in what Solomon did. And how fine the attire was. Remember the Queen of Sheba and her amazement at all that she saw. The text tells us that silver was just almost like gravel. It was just worthless. Gold was so plentiful in Solomon's kingdom. And I suppose just like today, a fellow with a pocket full of money thinks that he just spends that money and buys these things that, man, that'll make me happy. And what Solomon found out was, no, it really doesn't make you happy. We might think it, but especially if we don't have it. We might think, if I had that now, then I'd be happy. Well, there'd be some problems, no doubt, solved. Wouldn't have to worry about the light bill this month. We'll be able to get the roof fixed or whatever it might be. But no, it's not where happiness is found. And Solomon talks about that over the 2nd chapter in verse 12. And I turned and to behold wisdom and madness and folly. What can the man do that comes after the king? Just what's been done. We read that a moment ago. Then he says in verse 13, and then I saw that wisdom excels folly as far as light excels darkness. Solomon says, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that learning doesn't have a place. I think learning is better than ignorance. Unless you make learning your God. Then you got a problem. He said, the wise man's eyes, verse 14, are in his head. The fool walks in darkness. But he said, this is what I came to realize is, whether you're a wise man or a fool, you're going to the same place. All will die. And then I said in my heart, verse 15, as it happens to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? At a time when Solomon was far from God, wasn't thinking about God, all he could then realize is, well, I'm headed for the same place the fool is, and so how much better off really am I? And he became disappointed, even bitter, about his life. He said, there's no remembrance of the wise man more than the fool forever. Seeing that which now is in the days to come shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man as the fool? Verse 17. You ever notice how? I'm sure you have. But it took me a while before it really struck me of how powerful these words are. He said, therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me. For all is vanity and vexation of spirit. He explains the next verse. He says, yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun, because, why? Because I should leave it unto the man that'll come after me. And who knows whether he be a wise man or a fool. Solomon comes to that point when he's far from God and he's busy and distracting himself in all these building projects and all these things that he's got. And then he comes to realize, I'm doing all this work and I'm not getting any younger and I'm going to die. And then what? I'm not going to take it with me. I'm not even sure who's going to get it or what will happen to it. And said, I hated life. I think that's a mark of the ungodly man. Don't you see a contrast with this passage and that passage over in, well, there's several, but then we don't have time. But 1 Chronicles 29, I think it is, when David comes to the end of his life, and he's gathered all this stuff, but God said, you're not build the temple, David. You leave that for Solomon, but you're not going to build the temple. And David acquiesced to that. And he prays this great prayer that we've read many times in 1 Chronicles 29, when he writes, Thine, O Lord, is the kingdom and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, and all in the heaven and the earth is thine. Glory be to God. And his prayer is that God might be with and help his son and help Israel as after David's gone, that they might. What a different spirit. David at the end of his life here is not saying, I hate life because I'm going to die and leave my stuff behind. But that's where the materialist winds up. He's never satisfied, and he recognizes to his horror that what he's really devoted his life to, he's not going to keep. There's no satisfaction in that. He that loves silver shall not be satisfied with silver. He that loves abundance with increase. This is vanity. It's vanity. He said in verse 11 of chapter 5, when goods increase, they increase that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? Even at our income level, we can appreciate that, can't we? The more income, the more outgo. Don't you find that to be true? The more you get a raise at work, you wind up writing a bigger check going out the door to somebody else. Where's the satisfaction in that? Things seem to go through your fingers. The sleep of the laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. I thought it was a good point a fellow made one time. He said, the more things I possess, the more things possess me. Just coming up here this morning, Don and I passed a fellow driving a U-Haul truck. U-Haul, looked like the back of that U-Haul was about that big. It was a box, about that big. And we were talking about how we moved to West Virginia years ago, started preaching up there. I said, that's about the size truck we took with us. We could fit everything we had. We didn't have a dining room table. We bought a secondhand couch, all that. You've been through that stuff. Many of you have. Most of you have. And now, we couldn't fit one room in that little truck. And we don't have a lot of stuff that's valuable, but it's just stuff. It's stuff you got to keep up with. You got to move. You got to wash. You got to take care of. You got to paint it. You got to buy insurance for it, whatever it might be. Just stuff. And the older you get, the less stuff means to you. That's where I am anyway. I don't want any more stuff. I really don't. I'm looking to get rid of I don't want to die and have my kids have to get rid of all my stuff. Stuff does not bring us happiness. We enjoy it for a while. It has its place. But in the end, if it's your God, it just rules you and it makes you miserable. Worrying about it. There's a sore evil which I've seen under the sun, namely riches, kept for the owner thereof to their hurt. Here's a man who hoards up what he has and doesn't share. But there's something about God's providence that in many cases God might take that away from him. And so what he thought he was going to hand over to his son is not even there. And here's the truth. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came. We've all heard that point, talking about that U-Haul. You never saw a hearse pulling a U-Haul, did you? You never saw anybody who could take it with them. People live like they can, but they're not right. 3,000 years ago, Solomon said that with all he had, He said, I tell you, it's a sore evil. If your life is devoted to laboring for the wind, you can't learn that lesson young enough, too young, I should say. When you start out, you're going to need to make an honest living. You're going to need to prepare yourself to do that. It's right to do that. And there's a value to money. And if we had time, we could talk about Ecclesiastes. Money is a defense. You know, there's a blessing to having things. But if that's your God and that's your life and that's what you sacrifice, and that's number one, he says it's a cruel God that'll leave you miserable. And we all know that to be so. So wisdom, madness, and folly are still avenues that people are chasing after. And they're still dead ends. It's not my favorite book on Ecclesiastes, but it's my favorite title, I think. A fellow wrote a book years ago and he called it, talking about Ecclesiastes, he said, The Art of Staying Off Dead-End Streets. And I thought, that's a clever title. And I think it's partly true. And we've tried to mention something about that this morning. But I only think it's partly true. I don't think Ecclesiastes is just about staying off dead-end streets. It also is about getting on the right street. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. I want tonight, to in a positive way, mostly, to look and to think about what does make life worthwhile. And I think Ecclesiastes, again, has advice, inspired instruction that will help us to not waste our life, but to find joy in life that the world doesn't know. And so I think we'll pause there and we'll pick up maybe this evening. So, Brother Hall, forgive me. At this time, do we extend the invitation or do we have that? All right, let's do that then now. I appreciate your kind attention and your patience with this lesson. I realize these are very fundamental, basic subjects, but I do think they're relevant to us. We talk about first principles lessons, and many times what I mean when I say that is I want to tell somebody how to go from not being a Christian to being a Christian. And that's important. You need to understand that Jesus came to die for you. That God became man so that he could be the sacrifice for your sin. You need to hate sin and turn away from it. You need to thank God for his great sacrifice and obey the gospel by being baptized into Christ. As Christ was buried and raised again, we, dead in sin, are buried and raised to walk in newness of life. And that's right. What these lessons really are about, I think, in many ways, are why should I need God at all? I think if we can convince a fellow he needs God, showing him how to obey God, not that hard. It's trying to get the modern world to understand that there's a better life in serving God. You may well understand that. Maybe there's somebody here this morning who understands that, but you've not taken that step to become his child, to be baptized into Christ and put on Christ. I hope you will this morning. We'd be glad to receive you and help you. Maybe as a child of God, if there's anything that has separated you from the Lord that loves you so, why not today come back to him? Again, if we can help you, if we can assist you, please let us know how right now as we stand and as we sing. Thy cross we lay,